Suppose you are in crippling debt and someone were to approach you on the street and offer you a deal. And this is completely in the style of Squid Game. And you could completely get rid of that debt if you came within, went through their time machine, and you got drafted into any war in history. The question is, at least for me, what war would you want to be drafted in? In other words, how would you rank the wars? Which ones are absolutely terrible? Which ones are less worse? They're all bad, but where would they rank? I often wondered this question, and yes, that's a very normal thing to wonder about. Don't worry, not that I'm in debt or anything, right? Of course not. None of us are. But we're gonna be covering 4 wars today. We're gonna be ranking them at B, A, and S tier. They only need 3 tiers because it doesn't really get any better than terrible. So the wars we're gonna be looking at today is World War One, the American Civil War, Vietnam, and the Napoleonic Wars. And the tiers are S tier, absolute hell. Does not get worse than absolute hell. We have A tier, you might survive, but you wish you didn't. In other words, the condition that you're left in, the effects, the PTSD, everything, disease, anything that follows is so bad, your life is ruined. And then the last tier is B tier, which is rough, but you got a shot. In other words, you can survive and you can have a semi-normal life after. Alright, World War One, and just before you say anything, everyone knows it was bad, and I don't think people understand how bad it was on a personal level. On a grand scale, people understand how many people died, what it looked like, but how was it for you? And that's what we'll be looking at today. How's it going to be if you got drafted and they're in a time machine? So picture this. You show up on the Western Front. You're not fighting in a field, you're living in a ditch. In a small ditch crammed with a bunch of people, possibly people spreading diseases, and really keep that in mind. About 75% of all casualties in World War One came from artillery. And also keep in mind, this is not the Civil War where you're out on the field. And keep in mind, you're in a trench, which is a ditch. So yes, you do have cover from bullets flying all over the place, and they're going to fly over your head literally. But also, you guys are all confined in a little area. So if an artillery strike comes, they know exactly where to aim because you guys are all crammed into a ditch, a narrow ditch in the ground. So it's has its pros and cons. But on a quiet day in the Western Front, hundreds of soldiers died. But that's a quiet day. So as good as it gets is hundreds of people dying, and there is a statistically pretty good chance that could be you. Even though there's thousands and thousands of soldiers, it doesn't really make me feel good if I was teleported to this war and on a quiet day hundreds of people die. The average life expectancy of a soldier in the trenches was about 6 weeks. Average 6 weeks. That's not very long. I do not like those odds a lot, and that is devastating. And how was the life in the trenches? And that's not when there's a bunch of gunfire, artillery, or everything flying over your head. Well, when it rains, the water really collects in those trenches, so it tends to be very flooded. And it was almost always flooded from the rain. And your feet had been wet for days, which matters because trench foot was a fungal infection that in bad cases turned gangrenous and ended up in amputation. So not only are you going to be, on average, dead in 6 weeks, are you going to get absolutely murdered in the trenches, but you might even get your leg amputated. And by the way, just so you know, that's not talking about your leg amputated and you just living your life. Your leg is amputated on the battlefield. You still have to survive, but unfortunately that was the least of your problems because at night the rats came out. Everybody's favorite. These weren't regular rats. These grew enormous and fed on the dead bodies. So that was another thing, is there's a lot of dead bodies around you. You don't have the energy or the time to go and pick up all the dead bodies and move them. So now you're just inviting these enormous rats to come in. That's yet another problem on top of everything. Some soldiers describe them as nearly cat-sized. That's massive. No. We don't like rats, we especially don't like cat-sized rats. But now we're on to the Battle of Somme for a reason, and this happened on July 1st, 1916. The British had a plan: bombard German lines for 7 days straight, then walk across no man's land and take what's left. On the first day, British troops suffered 60,000 casualties. That is a lot of casualties. The Germans have dug deep to survive the shellings. They came back up, set their machine guns, and they waited. And the British walked across in broad daylight. It is the worst single day in British military history. It was supposed to be a routine offensive. It was not. They suffered an unreal amount of casualties. Bassam was not the only bad thing about this war. You had Passchendaele in 1917. The bombardment destroyed the entire drainage system of the region, and then it rained, the heaviest rains in 30 years. To say the least, that is not good. And then what you're left with is not a battlefield, it's a swamp made of mud, shell craters, barbed wire, decomposing bodies. That's like a breeding ground for disease, and that just sounds terrible. When a senior British staff officer finally visited the battlefield, he reportedly burst into tears and said, "Good God, did we really send men to fight in that?" It was that bad. Literally, it was absolute hell. So to put this all into perspective for World War I, and this is just from a personal experience, if you were in a time machine and drafted into this war, flooded trenches, rats biting your face, feet rotting, 6,000 people dying every single day around you, even your friends that you made 2 weeks ago, perhaps. You might get ordered to walk into machine gun fire. You could literally drown in mud, in a lake of mud. There's a chance a gas cloud rolls in that you didn't notice for hours, and a few hours later you were thinking you were fine, but you come to realize that you're not, and you're gonna die of mustard gas. So to no surprise, World War I ends up in S tier, absolute hell. I think we all saw this one coming, but I still put in a big section with how it would be for you personally. Survival was almost impossible, aside if you were lucky from all those conditions that we talked about. I mean, the combination of poison gas, drowning in mud, rats, the psychological destruction, not to even mention that. I just don't see how this is anything but absolute hell. The American Civil War is the last very uniform, old-style war where you had people marching in groups, infantry in groups, and they were all firing at the same time, mainly because their guns were very inaccurate. So here's a little fun fact for you guys. For every 3 soldiers killed in battle, 5 more died of disease. The thing most likely to kill you isn't a bullet, it's the water that you're drinking out of, which is not good. Water is one of the most important things for soldiers. If you can't even drink clean water, I think this is probably going to be a pretty bad experience. 2/3 of the approximately 660,000 deaths in the Civil War were caused by infectious disease. So let's go ahead and just dive into the daily life of it. Not even on the battlefield, but just how it is outside of that. And that's the camp life. Soldiers routinely constructed latrines close to streams, contaminating the water for everyone downstream. And you are cooking with, drinking, washing in water that's been contaminated by human waste from the camp upstream. So there goes your water supply. Diarrhea and dysentery were the #1 killers of the Civil War. 57,000 deaths from those causes alone. That is a lot. The question is, how do they treat these conditions? Well, don't worry, I can tell you exactly what the surgeons did. Well, surgeons tried turpentine, lead acetate, sulfuric acid, silver nitrate, and belladonna. And by the way, just so you know, turpentine is it's like the paint thinner. But let's say that you stay healthy and make it to the battlefield on September 17th, 1862, Antietam. The Battle of Antietam is the single bloodiest day in United States military history. Almost 23,000 total casualties in one day. That is over 1,800 men per hour. There's a spot called the Sunken Road, an old farmland worn down by wagon traffic, sitting lower than the surrounding ground. Confederate troops used it as a natural trench, and they cut down rank after rank of Union troops until they were flanked. So this was not a very survivable condition to be in if that was you. But don't worry, it gets even better. By the end of the day, Confederate bodies were strewn so thickly it was impossible to take a step without touching a corpse. So it was quite literally a giant compacted graveyard, but the bodies weren't buried. Now, we briefly touched on this, but how really was the medical care? 3 out of 4 surgeries in the Civil War were amputations. 3 out of 4. That is 75%. It really all comes down to you not getting injured, somehow not getting disease from the contaminated water, not getting killed on the battlefield. So if you see what I'm saying, the chance of survival is becoming really, really slim. But just imagine you got shot in the arm, shot in the leg. Well, your arm and your leg is off, so say goodbye to that. The mini ball, which was a standard bullet, they shattered on impact, which is really bad. So it just completely messes up the entire area that it hits. And at that time, the surgeons were left with no choice but to amputate, at least as far as they knew. Anesthesia actually existed back then. I don't know if you guys knew that. They had chloroform, so at least you were unconscious, but here's what nobody tells you. Surgeons never washed their hands. You would be surprised how late in American history that we realized that washing your hands actually helps a lot. Scary to think about. We went most of human history without knowing that you should wash your hands. That's like crazy for us to think about these days. Surgical instruments were rinsed and used bloody water. That's not very sanitary, I can tell you that right now. Germ theory was not established until 1865, the final year of the war. So they didn't know bacteria even existed. Think about that. They didn't know even it existed. They weren't being careless. They just didn't know. But with all that being said, finally, where does this war rank? Is it B? Is it A tier? Is it S tier? I would probably give this an A tier. It's not quite S tier where it's absolute hell like World War I was. But I give it the you might survive, but you wish you didn't. And the reason is because so many people were infected by diseases. They had amputations. The condition that they were after the war, especially considering this was in the 1860s or 1870s. And you were left in such a condition where at that time, it was just hard to live your life. It's not like modern medicine. So I think that it just either kills you or permanently damages you to where you have a hard time living your life. That, to me, I think is an A tier. All right, next on our list, we have the Vietnam War. And this one's interesting because you guys might actually know some Vietnam War veterans. In terms of history, it really wasn't that long ago. As horrific as World War I and the Civil War was, this war is a little bit different, and I'll explain why in a minute. But for your information, 58,220 Americans died in Vietnam. That number honestly doesn't capture what made this war uniquely terrifying. Because the thing that defined the Vietnam wasn't the scale of the killing or these large battles like in the Civil War and World War I. It's really the fact that you never felt safe. And that is because of the type of warfare it was. However, I want you to put yourself into a soldier's shoes in the Vietnam War. So you show up and the first thing that hits you is the environment itself. The humidity regularly exceeds 90%. So that is almost like no different than raining out. You're going to be drenched in water. Your clothes are soaked within minutes and they are never dry. Weapons rusted overnight despite constant cleaning. Clothing rotted on soldiers' backs. Leather boots disintegrated just after weeks in the field. So I don't know about you guys, but I hate when my clothes are wet. And that's also really bad if you're a soldier, if you have wet clothes on you, because everything's going to stick to you. Bugs are going to track to you. And it's also really unhealthy and unsanitary, which is one of the worst things for a war. You're carrying over 70 pounds of gear through one of the densest jungles on Earth, and heat pushing into the high 90s, and fungal infections attacking your feet. Keep in mind, your feet are soaked from the humidity. And to no surprise, malaria killed a lot of people in the Vietnam War, and within nearly 10% of American soldiers coming down with the disease, it reduced the combat strength of some units by half. But next, we have exactly why I was telling you you never feel safe. It's because of the booby traps. There were traps everywhere in the jungle. The Viet Cong built an entire system of booby traps throughout the jungle, and they were absolutely everywhere. It is estimated that around 11% of deaths and 15% of wounds to American soldiers were caused by booby traps and mines. So just think about that. You could be walking, and the next second, you could step through a fake, like, leaf ground thing into spikes. They used to do that. They'd cover leaves on the ground, and you would just think it's a pile of leaves, and you would fall right through into spikes. The most notorious ones were punji sticks. These were sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in camouflage pits along paths. They were coated in fences or urine with the goal of causing infection to whoever's impaled. So essentially they were poison, just to make it worse, if it can get any worse. In a 1967 U.S. military surgical report, it was estimated that for every 3 weeks of combat, 324 men were hospitalized from punji stick wounds alone. But the punji pits weren't even the most creative. The bamboo whip was a pole pulled back like a spring against a tripwire with a foot-long spike attached. When triggered, it traveled up to 100 miles per hour and impaled whoever set it off. There were grenades hidden in caves on tripwires. There were flags left behind rigged to explode when soldiers grabbed them for souvenirs. Punchy sticks were even placed in open fields where helicopters were expected to drop in troops, so when soldiers dove for cover under fire, they impaled themselves on the hidden stakes beneath the grass. Yeah, so you can't do anything. They literally rigged and put traps in the entire jungle. And aside from the traps that these soldiers hung up, there were a lot of snakes. The Viet Cong would hang bamboo pit vipers, called the two-stepper, by soldiers because of how fast the venom could kill. In my personal opinion, what is really bad about this war is the guerrilla warfare. And that kind of makes it so the enemies are everywhere, but nowhere at the same time because you can't see them. There could be someone laying in a bush 10 feet from you and you would have no idea, and they can open fire on an entire squad of people because no one's looking at them. I think that perfectly describes this war. It's not so much about being on the front lines like the other wars. It's about surviving the jungle. But that's another thing, is this war had a lot of psychological warfare, and a lot of them got PTSD. And by the way, just so you know, PTSD is the same as shell shock. It's just a new name. They went through many different variations of PTSD, but it wasn't recognized as a medical condition until 1980, 5 years after the war ended. So a lot of these people were really psychologically damaged, and they still are to this day. So overall, considering that this war is not only obviously fighting the enemy with guns, but in my opinion, most of the war was just trying to stay alive in the jungle, in the heat, not dying by booby traps, not dying by people in guerrilla warfare with ghillie suits on, blending into the bushes, the trees. And I think that would get to me, just the sheer amount of uncertainty in this war above the others. I think I would put this in A tier. It's not S tier. It's definitely not B tier. You might survive. There's a decent chance you'll survive, but a lot of people wish they didn't because they're riddled with disease. They also have PTSD, which is terrible. And the main reason is I can't justify the Vietnam War being on the same tier as World War One. And keep in mind, this is for you personally, if you were drafted into the war. I can't imagine that your experience would be on the same level as World War One, but it's very different. They're two very different wars, but I do think an A tier is appropriate. All right, moving on. Last on this list, we have the Napoleonic Wars. For you as a soldier, how would the battlefield look? Now, there was many different battles, so this is very generalized. But it was fought in an era that had a specific war that people don't talk about enough, and that's that you don't get a trench. This is going back to similar to the Civil War, where you are in line infantry. You're just out in the open, you're spraying and praying and just hoping they hit as many people as possible because the guns were very inaccurate. But this was way earlier than the Civil War. Civil War is in the 1860s, 1861 to 65. This is in the early 1800s, so these guns were less accurate, took longer to reload, so they really were in line infantry, just trying to hit as many people as possible, and you had no cover. You were just hoping that you got lucky and the enemies missed. But how this looked is you marched in 2 or 3 rows. You'd be shoulder to shoulder with the other soldiers there. Also, another bad thing was the grape shot cannon, which consisted of small iron bars held together in clusters when fired. So everyone knows a cannon, like those big cannons on the ground. Think of it like a cannon, but a shotgun, where it has huge bullet spread, and it doesn't have a lot of range, but it just decimates everything in its path. That's what the grape shot is. But even though this was the early 1800s, it was still very powerful. It had a bunch of golf ball sized lead balls, and it could plow through rows of people. So this was really powerful. Don't let the year that this was operating fool you. It was very powerful. But the grape shot would result in a quick death. Now, some people obviously got shot in the arm, and they would have literally torn up arms or limbs, which is really bad. But what else is really bad is, for example, at the battle at Waterloo, there were people who lost their legs or got severely injured, and they were still alive and conscious, but they were laying on the field for hours waiting for help. And in many cases, it took days, 2, 3, 4 days for people to come and help them or transport them. So that's not really good. If not only are you trying to survive, but if you do get shot, you're just laying there to die, and you just hope in 3 days laying on the ground that someone comes and saves you. That's not good battlefield conditions. And keep in mind, this is earlier than the Civil War. They have even less information, less tools, less medical knowledge. So if you had surgery waiting for you, the surgeons had limited tools and no effective pain relief. Mainly opium and alcohol were available, but amputating an arm might take 1 minute or 2 minutes, and that was considered mercy. That is a quick amputation. No painkillers. You get to feel everything. I don't know if you guys have seen the Napoleon movie with River Phoenix in it. It was decent, but this part was certainly in there. It was actually an interesting scene. But Napoleon marched into Russia with 615,000 French allied troops in June of 1812, one of the largest armies ever assembled. And the Russians did something brilliant. They retreated. Because who in their right mind would want to face on 615,000 French soldiers? Yes, defending is easier than invading. Clearly, they probably assumed that they would lose, so they just retreated, and they went to St. Petersburg. But they did not just retreat and walk out and leave everything to be. No, they burned everything behind them. Crops, villages, food supplies. But of course, to no surprise, it's not the battles that killed the most people. It's starvation, typhus, and suicide that caused the most deaths, which you have to also keep in mind. And this was towards the Russian winter, so they were also freezing, which is this is the whole next thing. This is, I hate the cold. To me, this is what makes this worse than the Civil War. Now, to give you some context, they were waiting for the Tsar to surrender, but he never did, so they were in a long limbo of just waiting. And then, of course, the longer you wait, the closer that winter is going to be, and that eventually did happen. But Napoleon's army began retreating from Moscow on October 19th in fine weather. 3 days later, rain turned into mud. On November 6th, snow fell and soldiers froze to death literally overnight. So it begins. The eyewitnesses reports of men cutting open dead horses and sleeping inside them for warmth. I don't know if you guys remember the opening scene from Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back where Han Solo is out in that snowy planet and he cuts open that like white like horse camel alien thing and he sleeps inside it. But that's what they were doing. That's all they could do to stay warm. It was that or freezing to death. Also, men were murdering people to make fur coats. So they got so desperate that they were cutting into horses, killing other people. It was bad. The Russian winter is no joke. But one of the worst things was frostbite, which is terrible. And, people had frostbite everywhere if you weren't properly covered. They had disintegrating boots, so you just get frostbite everywhere, which is really bad. But to put this all into perspective, of these 615,000 who crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 staggered back out 6 months later. That is 500,000 losses. 380,000 had died. The rest were prisoners or deserters. That is 84% loss rate on one campaign. That is very devastating. So how would I rate the Napoleonic Wars? I would give it an A tier. You might survive, but you wish you didn't. It really is that tier because it's in a very, very, very similar situation as the American Civil War, to where, yes, you can survive, but you're going to be riddled with disease or amputations. And it's not really the war itself that's going to get you killed. There's a lot of other things. The thing is, you also have to consider the time, which is in the early 1800s. If you get a limb amputated today, you can, of course, get a robotic arm. You have modern medicine. You can easily live your life. Back then, you are really screwed. It's really bad. So you're left in a permanent state of misery after the war. But still, considering all of this, this still does not compare to World War I. Absolutely, this is not anywhere near S tier or absolute hell like World War I is. This is really bad. I mean, notice none of the wars were even in B tier. These are all A or S tier. But I still cannot say in any right state of mind that the Napoleonic Wars were in any way on par with World War I. I still think World War I was much worse. But that will conclude the 4 wars today. I think these are very fair rings, but let me know where you guys rank them. Let me know what tier you guys put them in and why. Or if you disagree with something I said, let me know. I love to hear it. But if you guys do enjoy this video, I would be more than fine making more of these. It was actually very fun to make. And I won't cover this too much, but I made a content change on my channel. I did other types of commentary content, but I want to move on to stuff like this. So it was very fun doing the research and I enjoyed it. So let me know what you guys think, and I will see you next time.